I'm going to ask you the next couple weeks to stand on the faithfulness of God. And we're going to look at the covenants in the next couple chapters. At the end of this chapter, in Ezekiel chapter 16, we're going to watch God be faithful over and over and over and over. And the question is, do we really value the faithfulness of God? Do we really, when we think about, okay, most people, if I asked you when you walked in the room, most people who come to church, if I asked you is God faithful, you'd probably nod, you'd probably say, yes, it's the right answer, it's the churchy answer. But how much do you need God to be faithful when life's falling apart? I mean, how much do you need God to be faithful when you finally come to your senses and realize you've been sinning? How much do you need him to be faithful to forgive in that moment? How much do you need him to be faithful to teach you and to comfort you when you've got a kid who's just wandering away from God? How much do you need him to be faithful to guide you and to lead you when you're trying to figure out what do you want me to do with my life? Is he just going to leave you hanging? Is he just going to leave you without purpose? How much do you need the faithfulness of God to teach you when maybe your kids haven't gone wayward yet because they're too small and you're just like, well, I don't even know what to do with my kids right now? How much faithfulness of God does the person who's been abused need to trust God to be faithful to redeem and restore and renew and heal? See, I think that we sing about the faithfulness of God, and I think that we would all give the churchy answer of like, yes, God is faithful. I'm just not quite sure that when we see it in the Scripture or we see it questioned in the Scripture, if we really understand how important it is in our moment of need. The people of God in Babylon are wrestling with what Ezekiel is telling them. They're still trying to figure out, is the prophet of God Ezekiel, who's telling us that the city and the temple and everything's going to be destroyed, or is it these other prophets that are like, nah, it's not going to be destroyed, you're going to be fine? And they're trying to figure out who to believe. And in their mind, they're remembering the covenants. I mean, God made these covenants said that he would bless them. He would make them a great nation, a great people. Said that he would put on the throne of David one of his sons, and he would rule forever. But Ezekiel is talking about the destruction of the city, the removal of the king, the destruction of the temple, the presence and the dwelling place of God. So the question mark in these passages and what people of God surely are wrestling with in Babylon is, how can God be faithful if this is what he's going to do? I mean, okay, we might say that maybe we'll admit the people of Jerusalem are not the greatest. Okay. But how does God destroy the city, destroy his people, scatter them, destroy the temple, and remain faithful to the fact that he said he would bless them, he would keep them, he would put somebody on the throne to rule them forever? How does he balance those two things? And so we're going to watch in the text today and in the week, chapter 17 and then chapter 18 again, we're going to deal with these covenants, these promises that God has made. How do those fare in light of what Ezekiel is telling the people of God, that they're going to be destroyed? How does he balance those two things? The answer, you go back to Sunday school, back to 5th grade, 5 years old, whatever. The answer is Jesus Christ. But how? How do we get there, and how do we make sense of these things? So what's at stake the next couple of weeks is whether or not the God of the Bible is faithful. And if he is endlessly faithful, how much security, how much peace, how much rest, how much healing should that gives to us? Let me ask you a different way. Who wants to be in a relationship with an unfaithful spouse? Who wants to be in a relationship with an unfaithful friend? So if the people in the text are going to question the faithfulness of God, your ears ought to perk up and say, oh, well, are they right? And I promise you, at the end of the text, you'll sit back in your chair and you'll go, oh, they weren't right. Whew. But then again next week, what about this? But then again next week, what about this? And time again, you're going to see God prove his faithfulness, and you're going to see that happen in Jesus Christ if you put all the pieces together. So is God faithful? Answer is yes. How do we know? The answer is Jesus Christ. It's the proof that God is as faithful as you hope he is, as I hope he is. How many of you, as we jump into the text, Ezekiel chapter 16, we left off at verse 44 last week. How many of you have heard the phrase, like mother, like daughter? Some of you have heard it in a positive way. Oh man, little girl's so cute, just like her mom. So faithful, so giving, so trusting, just like her mom. You've heard it in a positive way. It's not going to be positive in this text. In the weeks prior, Ezekiel has described Jerusalem as, your mother's a Hittite. Your mother's an Amorite. And the point is, I talked about last week or the week before, you're corrupt. You're from corrupt people. And he's going to repeat that. In other words, when he says this parable is going to be true about you, like mother, like daughter, that's a negative in this text, verse 44. Behold, everyone who quotes Proverbs will quote this proverb concerning you. This is Ezekiel talking to the exiles on behalf of God, saying, like mother, like daughter. And in case you were confused at whether or not that's positive or negative, the next verse is clear. Verse 45, you are the daughter of your mother who loathed her husband and her children. You are also the sister of your sisters who loathed their husbands and their children. And your mother was a Hittite and your father was an Amorite. And if you're paying attention closely to verse 16, or chapter 16, verse 45, and you go back to chapter 16, verse 3, you'll notice that your mother was a Hittite and your father was an Amorite are switched. They're flip-flopped. In verse 3, it was your mother was an Amorite and your father was a Hittite. And you say, well, which one is it? And the point is that it's a metaphor. They're representations of paganism. They're representations of corruptness, Canaanites. It's not meant to be literal. It's meant to be a representation. So two kind of metaphors here. You're the daughter of your mother, but you're also the sister of your sisters who loathed her husband. Now you know from the last week or the text before that God, in the last analogy, he was the husband. And so when he says you loathed your husband, he's talking about himself. You loathed me. You loathed your husband. And the sister of your sisters. Here's the sisters, verse 46. Now your older sister is Samaria, who lives north of you. Samaria is the capital city of Israel. So when the kingdom split, southern tribe, southern kingdom, Jerusalem, capital city. Northern kingdom, Israel, capital city. Israel, capital city, Samaria. Samaria, who lives north of you with her daughters, and your younger sister, who lives south of you, Sodom, with her daughters. So the two cities, north, Samaria, south, Sodom. Here's the gut punch. Yet you have not merely walked in their ways or done according to their abominations, but as if it were too late, too little, you acted more corruptly in all your conduct than they. Most people in the church today, if I were to go to you and say, how bad was Sodom? They would say, it was the worst. I mean, God wiped them off the planet. I mean, he just destroyed them. They were the worst. No, they weren't. Jerusalem was the worst. Your sister Sodom, you did way worse than them. Could we get this in our minds just for a second? Because I guarantee if I went to you and said, how bad was Sodom and Gomorrah, probably most of you would be like, man, bad, so bad, real bad. Were they like the worst? Well, I mean, God completely destroyed the city, so I mean, they must have been like probably one of the worst of all the cities. No. Jerusalem was the worst. Worse even than this one who got destroyed from the face of the planet. Now, if the people in exile are trying to figure out, is Jerusalem going to be destroyed or are they not going to be destroyed? Here's another hint. Sodom, bad, destroyed by God. Jerusalem, worse. Put the pieces together. Are they going to be destroyed or are they not? And they can think through. Is there idolatry happening? Is Israel really that bad? And if they are, and God destroyed Sodom, surely that would mean then that God would destroy Jerusalem. He's trying to be somewhat logical. Here's the description of the sin of Sodom. Behold, verse 48. As I live, declares the Lord, Sodom, your sister and your daughters, have not done as you or your daughters have done. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had arrogance, abundant food, and careless ease, but she did not help the poor and the needy. I really hope that's not a description of America. I know the first part is true. Arrogance, abundant food, and careless ease. We live in one of the most prosperous nations of all the earth. Of all time, you could say. Could we be accused of taking our ease and neglecting those who are in need? Arrogance, gluttonous, complacency. They neglected the poor and the needy. You'll notice that the issue in this text is social, moral. Not idolatry in this instance. The issue is that they took what they had, they used it for themselves. We kind of talked about that a little last week. Verse 51, here is Samaria. That was Sodom. Here's Samaria. Verse 50. Thus they were haughty and committed abominations before me. Therefore I removed them when I saw it. Verse 51. Furthermore, Samaria did not commit half of your sins, for you have multiplied your abominations more than they. Samaria, when you think of Samaria, you realize, all of you have heard, or most of you have heard, the Jews hated the Samaritans, and the Samaritans hated the Jews. Why? Well, it's because the Jews were over here worshiping in the temple that Solomon had built, or worshiping in the temple that they rebuilt after they came back from exile, And Israel came over here, and they were like, you know what, that's not really the true temple. We actually built our own temple over here. I mean, yeah, we worship the same God, but actually the God that gave you the 10 Commandments on this mountain over here in Judah, he actually gave you the 10 Commandments over here on our mountain. And so they started changing the text, and they started changing the scriptures. And so the Jews in Judah were like, those guys are false. I mean, they've taken the text, they've twisted it. They say they worship the same God as us, but they don't. And the Samaritans are over here going, we have the truth. Does this sound anything like Mormonism to you? I mean, come on. Joseph Smith looked at the church and he said, they are all corrupt. I have the truth. And if you want to be a part of the true church, you come over here and you follow me because all those guys are corrupt. They built their own churches. But God says to Jerusalem, even though you have the truth, you still committed it way worse than them. Like mother, like daughter. The point is, they're corrupt. They inherited the nature of their mother. Now, notice in the next couple verses, he's not excusing Samaria or Sodom. When he compares the two, he's putting them on a spectrum. Sodom and Samaria are over here, this kind of bad, and then Jerusalem is way over here, this kind of bad, but he doesn't excuse any of them. None of them get excused from violating God. The reality is that Jerusalem and her two sisters, they're corrupt, but Jerusalem is the worst. Second half of verse 51. Thus you have made your sisters appear righteous by all your abominations which you have committed. Also, bear your disgrace in that you have made judgment favorable for your sisters. Notice they're all being judged. Because of your sin, which you acted more abominably than they are more in the right than you. Yes, be also ashamed and bear your disgrace in that you made your sisters appear righteous. Nevertheless, I will restore their captivity, the captivity of Sodom and her daughters, the captivity of Samaria and her daughters, and along with them, your own captivity. So there is going to be restoration, but in the process of there being restoration, they're going to have to bear their own humiliation. In the process of restoration, when you come to Jesus, in the process of Him reconciling you, you have to be willing to bear your own shame. Otherwise, there's just judgment. If you're not willing to bear the responsibility of your own sinfulness, there is no restoration. But if you want restoration, got to go through that process of accepting, taking responsibility. Here's the reason why, verse 54. In order that you may bear your humiliation and feel ashamed for all you have done when you become a consolation to them, when you become a consolation to the neighbors. We talked about that last week. Here's the turn for restoration. It's verse 55. If you don't see this in the text again and again and again, you're not reading carefully. If you read through the Old Testament and you think it's all judgment and all harsh and all critical, you've missed these little texts as you're reading. Verse 55. Your sisters Sodom with her daughters and Samaria with her daughters will return to their former state, and you with your daughters will also return to your former state. There is a turn for restoration, but here's the reality, verse 56. As the name of your sister Sodom was not heard from your lips in the day of your pride, because Israel hated Sodom, they were the epitome of the Gentiles, before your wickedness was uncovered, so now you have become the reproach of the daughters of Edom, and of all who are around her, of the daughters of the Philistines, these surrounding you who you despise. You have become an abomination to even your worst enemies. You have borne the penalty of your lewdness and abominations. The reality is, even though restoration is coming, and we're going to talk more about restoration here in a second, even though restoration is coming, it will not come without first destruction. Restoration will come, but God will discipline. And this should be a scary thing to you and me. He will restore us as Christians one day, make everything new, you and I, our bodies, the whole world, new heavens and new earth. It'll be great. Restoration will come, but be careful in the meantime. Because if he chooses to discipline, that could come long before restoration. Here's the real point of what God's trying to get at. Up to this point, we've had hints in the book of Ezekiel. Hints. God describing his judgment in such a way that it reflects the law and the curses of the covenants. And we've seen that in multiple different ways. We tried to look at it in chapter 3 and chapter 4 and 5 and 6. Go back to Leviticus 26. These are curses that God promised would come to the people if they were rebellious. This is the first time in the book that we actually get the real issue said plainly. It's verse 59. For thus says the Lord God, I will do also with you as you have done. You have despised the oath by breaking the covenant. Bottom line, you broke the covenant. And this is the first time in the book that we get this. We get a lot of different descriptions about it. And remember I said in the Hebrew, when you're reading through the prophets, they'll deal with an issue once, and then they'll deal with an issue again, and then it'll come up again, and then it'll come up again. And every time you're looking for something new, every time it gets brought up, there's some added. There's another piece. There's another way of looking at it. This is the new piece. You're covenant breakers. You violated the covenant that I made with you. And although the punishment of God is coming, it is temporary. The curse of God for the people of God is not permanent. It is changeable. Here's why. Because the promise of restoration is always alive for those who truly follow God. Ezekiel's giving this message to the people in Babylon. And we've seen him say to the people in Babylon, you're the hope of God. You're the one who God is going to use to restore all things. And so he's telling them that destruction is going to come. But there is this promise of restoration. Why? Because they are the faithful ones. So here's the promise of the faithfulness of God that I think we all need. And we're going to see the promise here and then ask the question, did God actually keep his promise? Verse 60. Nevertheless, I will remember my covenant with you in the days of your youth. I will establish an everlasting covenant with you. Notice God is faithful to his people even when his people are not. You didn't remember your covenant. You forgot that I saved you from nothing. You forgot that I gave you everything. But even though you forgot, I'll remember my covenant. And the question in this text is, which covenant? He doesn't actually say. Which covenant are we talking about? But he gives us two descriptions. One description is in the days of your youth. The covenant was made in the days of your youth. And the second description is an everlasting covenant. So we have these two descriptors to try to figure out which covenant is Ezekiel telling the people he's going to remember. And by the way, when it says, I will establish an everlasting covenant with you, that's like, I will fulfill. He's not making a new covenant. It's, I will fulfill the same covenant that he's going to remember in the very first part of the verse. So which covenant are we talking about? There's 6 options for an everlasting covenant. So there's 6 different covenants that are described as an everlasting covenant. So the question becomes, which one? So we just go down through them with these 2 criteria. The first one is the creation covenant. It's described as an everlasting covenant, but that's too early because this was a covenant made with them in the days of your youth, the days of the youth of the nation of Israel. But the creation with covenants the covenant with creation is too early. So the next one is the Sabbath covenant, and it's too late. Sabbath covenant was given with the 10 Commandments and following the 10 Commandments. It's too late. The formation of Israel has already happened. We already have leaders by this time. How many of you have heard of the Levitical covenant of salt? Raphael's the other one. Maybe Art. I hadn't even heard of this when I saw it. I was like, what? It's too specific. This is a specific covenant for Levitical priests. It doesn't have anything to do with the whole nation. It's specific. It's too specific. The Davidic covenant is described as an everlasting covenant, but it's also too late. It's not talking about the formation, the covenant I made with you at your youth. We already have kings by this time, 10 commandments. It's too late. And then we only get later after that. There's an eschatological covenant, which is a fancy term, theological term for end times. And that's talked about in the book of Isaiah. But it's also too late. We're talking about that covenant we're talking about is after us. So what's the only covenant in the scriptures that's described as an everlasting covenant that fits the time frame of being in the youth or the days of Israel? It's the Abrahamic covenant. There's only one that fits the 2 descriptions. And here's a summary of it. God's going to make Israel a great nation. He's going to bless them. He's going to make them a great name. And he's going to bless the nations through them. Listen to how God says he's going to restore and redeem. The last couple verses of this chapter, verse 61. Then I will remember your ways. Then you will remember your ways and be ashamed when you receive your sisters, both your younger and your older, and I will give them to you as daughters, but not because of your covenant. In other words, not because I made a covenant with them or because you made a covenant with them, but simply because I'm giving them to you. We'll flesh that out in just a minute. Thus I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall know that I am the Lord, so that you may remember and be ashamed and never open your mouth anymore because of your humiliation, when I have forgiven you for all that you have done. The renewing, the remembering of the establishing of the Abrahamic covenant is what causes, God says, the people to never again open their mouth against God. You'll never again speak against me. Why? Because I will forgive you in that moment. In that moment of me remembering my covenant, I'll forgive you. The connection at this point should be somewhat clear to you that Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. We're talking about forgiveness of God. We're talking about who can stand and say to God, you haven't been faithful to us, when they're looking at the cross? Nobody. And you say, God, Anthony, okay. It's a bit of a jump, maybe a leap, I'm not really sure. Go to Galatians chapter 3. Galatians chapter 3. This is the link that Paul is trying to get the Galatian church to understand. The connection between this promise that God made to the people and the fulfillment through Jesus Christ. Galatians chapter 3, Paul says this, therefore, be sure that it is those who are of faith who are sons of Abraham. The scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand, before Jesus Christ coming, to Abraham, saying, all the nations will be blessed in you. It's part of the promises. So what it's saying is God came to Abraham, and he knew Jesus Christ was going to come, and he was going to redeem not just the Jews, but also the Gentiles. And so he gave them this promise. You're going to be a blessing to all the nations. How? Because Jesus Christ is going to come, die, resurrect, and then the gospel is going to go not just to Israel, but to the nations. And when God forgives through Abraham, through Jesus Christ, He's going to prove himself faithful. Keep going in Galatians. So then those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham, the believer. For as many as are the works of the law are under a curse, for it is written, cursed is everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law. And then he gives the conclusion of that, now that no one is justified by the law. In other words, no one could possibly keep every rule in the book of the law. So no one is justified by the law. The righteous shall live by faith. It's not about following the law perfectly because you can't. It's about having faith in God. However, the law is not faith. It's just a rule book. But he who practices them shall live by them. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on the tree. And he climbed up on a tree and he sacrificed his own life. In order that in Jesus Christ, the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we would receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. And then lots of you know this passage at the end of Galatians chapter 3, which is connected to the beginning. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. You're all one in Jesus Christ. Why? Why are we all one in Jesus Christ? Because if you belong to Christ through faith, then you're Abraham's descendants, heirs according to the promise. See, the covenant that Ezekiel was talking about here, and he's telling the people in Babylon, you're unfaithful to me. You're the worst of the worst you can think of. You're worse than them. But I'm going to be faithful to you. And how he's faithful is through Jesus Christ. Paul tells us this. He's the fulfillment of this promise of God. Some of you are saying, well, what about Sodom and what about Samaria? Watch how Jesus connects Sodom and the redemption of Sodom and the redemption of Samaria in his life here on earth. This is Acts chapter 1. Jesus has died, resurrected from the dead. He's about to ascend to heaven. And he says this to his disciples. The writer says, when they, the disciples, came together, they were asking him, Jesus, saying, Lord, is it time for you to restore the kingdom of Israel? They're still all about the kingdom of Israel, and they're ready for him. And he said to them, it is not for you to know the times or the epochs of which the Father has fixed by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you'll be my witnesses in both Jerusalem and in all Judea, and you ready, Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. And you say, well, Anthony, there's no mention of Sodom there. Lots of people think that when Ezekiel mentioned Sodom, he was talking about the Gentiles, the whole of the rest of the world. Just like when he said, your mother was a Hittite and your father was an Amorite, he didn't specifically mean Hittite and an Amorite. They were figurative for corruption and paganism. And in the same way, Sodom is a figurative for the Gentiles. And so when Jesus gives this command, it's very specific. Go to Samaria. Go to the ends of the earth. Why? Because God is going to be faithful to the promise that he made to Abraham and to the promise that he made to the exiles in Babylon. Why is it important that God was able to keep his covenant for thousands of years? Why is it important that Jesus is the fulfillment of a covenant that was made so long ago to a people that seem so disconnected from us? It's important to us because it proves to us that God is a faithful God. I don't know what kind of God you want to serve. I don't know if you're interested in serving a God who's not faithful. You said you weren't interested in being married to someone who wasn't faithful or friends with someone who wasn't faithful. How much more are you interested in living in eternity with someone who's faithful? How important is it to you that God is faithful even when you're not? How important is it to you that God's ability to forgive is so wide that you couldn't possibly do anything that he wouldn't be willing to forgive? You couldn't possibly come up with any sort of rebellion of which God would say, that's a little bit too big. The Christ sacrifice on the cross can't quite atone for that. See, if we understand the faithfulness of God, then there's no reason to be afraid to come to him. There's no reason to be afraid to come to him in confession. There's no reason for you to be afraid to come to him and be honest or humble. I talked to a teenager this past week, and she said, for the first time in my life, I feel connected with God. I feel like he's near me. And then she told me this story of recently going to a church service, and they were playing the song, "Oh, Come to the Altar." Come to the altar, the Father's arms are open wide. And she said, I came to the front, and I just cried and cried and cried, cried. And I said, why? Why the tears? And she said, because I was so guilty. So guilty. But you see, what she walked away from that moment and that experience was not with a God who was like, you are just as bad as you think you are. She walked away from that experience with a God who would draw near to her, who would come close. Because he's faithful. Because he's faithful from one generation to the next. How important is it that God was able to keep his covenant even in the midst of an abusive people? Abuse all over the place. Abuse from the kingdom of God people, abuse from the nations around them. See, some abuse, people who have abuse in their lives, they get stuck. So broken, so depressed, so down in the dumps because of what's been done to me. I just don't know if God could ever use me. I'm that broken. And yet you have a God who brings about the life, death, and resurrection of his own Son, all in the midst of an abusive people. And through his life, death, resurrection, he brings redemption and renewal and restoration and reconciliation. So I say this nicely to people who have been through abuse. I don't care what level of abuse you have. It is not outside the realm of God to be able to restore and redeem and make new. I don't care how deep it goes. I don't care how many years it is. We're talking about a God who can orchestrate the coming of his Son and the salvation of humanity for hundreds of years across all kinds of peoples. He can bring you restoration and redemption because he's faithful. You don't have to be afraid to trust him because he's faithful. Because when he says he can redeem and restore, he'll do it. You said you don't want to be friends with an unfaithful person or an unfaithful spouse. Let the faithfulness of God bring you healing, bring you restoration, bring you reconciliation. Because week after week after week after week, we're going to see that God is faithful. When he says it, he'll do it. Now, balance this in your brain, Christian, just for a minute. He's faithful to punish, and he's faithful to forgive. And he is just. Because in the story, there's no redemption without first destruction. He's going to discipline them because they should know better. But just because he disciplines them does not mean he won't be able to restore them. That's what the people of God are wrestling with. So be careful how you live. He is a God of justice. He will discipline you, especially if you're one of his children. But when he does, don't lose hope. Don't lose faith. Don't lose the will to follow him, because he can restore, he can redeem. Pray with me. God, we need the security of an endlessly faithful God. One who, no matter abuse or rebellion or messed up evil people, he can still accomplish his faithfulness. Some of the people in the room need a God who's going to be more faithful than their father. Some people in the room need a God who's going to be more faithful than their spouse. God, we have a bunch of pictures in our lives of what unfaithfulness looks like, because we're all broken and we're all messed up. Hopefully, God, we have some pictures in our life of what true faithfulness looks like. God, would you remind us what true faithfulness looks like? God, don't let us take for granted the fact that you're faithful even when we're not. That we can come to you in humility, and you can forgive, and you can restore. Don't let us forget in our brokenness or get stuck in our depression so deep that we forget that you are the perfect healer. You said you will restore us, and you will. God, thanks for your faithfulness throughout the years. Thanks for your word that teaches us this. Don't let us miss it. And let us walk in the world knowing that when all else is chaos, you're faithful. When we're close to death, you're faithful to save. When we're trying to go through watching someone close to us die, you're faithful in that moment. Cancer, you're faithful to us. Our own sinfulness and unrighteousness, you're faithful even when we're not. God, remind us these things so that we draw near to you, and that as we draw near to you, God, you draw near to us. We need to feel your presence. We love you. We trust you. We're with you. There's nowhere else that we could go to get the satisfaction that we desire. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.